In one of Jakarta's crowded corners, where the sound of street vendors blended with the aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread, lived a young man named Rizal. He was 25, slim, quiet, and always seemed to be lost in thought. His eyes carried a calm sadness, as if he was searching for something he had once known but could never find again. Rizal worked in a small cafe near the university, serving coffee to students who came to study or chat after their lectures. From behind the counter, Rizal often watched them with quiet envy. They laughed, discussed projects, and spoke English fluently. Their words flowed like music he could hear but never join. He understood every sentence, every joke, every story, but when he tried to speak, the words froze inside his throat. It was as if there was an invisible wall between his mind and his mouth. He had studied English for years. In school and at university, he always scored well on exams. He could read books and articles easily. He even watched English movies without subtitles. Yet when it came time to speak, his voice disappeared. He would open his mouth, but only silence came out. One evening, Rizal sat in his small room above the cafe, staring into the old mirror hanging on the wall. The room was dim, lit by a single yellow bulb. He looked at his reflection and whispered, "I understand everything, but I can't say anything," said Rizal. His voice trembled. He lowered his head and sighed deeply, feeling a weight he had carried for years. It wasn't just a language problem. It was something that lived inside him, a fear, a shadow that silenced him whenever he wanted to express himself. The next day, while cleaning the counter, an old classmate walked in, Andra, a cheerful young man with an easy smile. "Rizal, I can't believe it's you," said Andra. "How have you been?" Rizal smiled faintly. "I'm fine. Just working here for now," said Rizal. Andra laughed. "You still don't talk much, huh? Just like in school." Rizal looked down and said quietly, "Maybe because I still can't speak English well." Andra frowned. "What? But you were the best at reading English texts." Rizal nodded. "Understanding is one thing. Speaking is something else," said Rizal. After Andra left, the cafe felt even quieter. Rizal continued his routine, working, cleaning, returning to his room at night, reading English books, and saying nothing. Each day blended into the next. He felt trapped in a silent circle he didn't know how to break. Then, one rainy afternoon, a girl walked into the cafe. She was holding a book, her hair slightly wet from the rain. She smiled politely and asked in English, "Is the cafe still open?" Rizal froze. His heart began to race. He managed to say, "Yes, it's still open," said Rizal. His accent was heavy, but his words were clear enough. The girl smiled and sat down by the window. Her name was Laura, a university student preparing for her exams. She spoke in English most of the time, asking about the coffee, the weather, the cafe's story. Rizal answered in short, hesitant phrases. "Hot coffee, yes. Window seat, better," said Rizal. She noticed how quickly she understood her, but how carefully he chose every word. The next day she came again, and the day after that. Over time, they began to talk more. Lara was kind and patient. She asked questions slowly, encouraged him to respond, and never corrected him harshly. Rizal began to look forward to her visits. One afternoon, as the sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, Lara looked at him and said with a gentle smile, "Rizal, why don't you talk more in English? You understand me so well." Rizal looked at his hands and said softly, "I don't know. When I try to speak, the words just disappear." Laura tilted her head. "Maybe you're afraid of making mistakes?" Rizal nodded. "Yes, I'm afraid people will laugh at me, that I'll sound stupid," said Rizal. Laura smiled kindly. "Mistakes aren't bad, Rizal. They mean you're learning. Everyone makes them." He was silent for a moment. Then he looked up and said, "I hate this feeling. Understanding everything, but saying nothing," said Rizal. Her words that day stayed in his mind. That night, he returned to his room, stood in front of the mirror again, and whispered to his reflection. "I am not afraid anymore," said Rizal. Then he smiled faintly and repeated in Indonesian, "Aku tidak takut lagi." From that night, Rizal began a new habit. Every morning, before going to work, he stood in front of the mirror and spoke to himself in English. He described his day, his feelings, his dreams. At first, his voice was shaky, his grammar uncertain. But slowly, his confidence grew. He even started recording his voice and listening to it later. Sometimes he laughed at his own mistakes, but he felt proud of every new sentence he managed to say. Weeks passed. One morning, he saw a flyer near the university cafe. English Conversation Club, every Friday evening. His heart pounded. He hesitated at first, but then he thought of Laura's words. Mistakes mean you're learning. That Friday, after finishing his shift, he walked to the small classroom where the club met. He entered quietly and sat at the back. There were about 10 people there, chatting happily in English. When his turn came to introduce himself, his palms were sweaty. His throat felt dry. But he took a breath and said, "My name is Rizal. I am from Jakarta." His voice trembled, but he said it. The group smiled. One of them clapped softly. "Nice to meet you, Rizal," said a girl sitting nearby. He smiled shyly. For the first time, instead of shame, he felt warmth. The warmth of being understood and accepted. That night, as he walked home, the streets of Jakarta felt different. The same noise, the same lights, but he felt lighter, freer, as if he had taken the first step out of a long, dark tunnel. Rizal continued to attend the English Conversation Club every week. At first, he spoke only a few sentences, but little by little, his words began to flow more easily. He listened carefully, learned new phrases, and even laughed at jokes. The people there were friendly, and no one judged his mistakes. One evening, after the club meeting ended, an older man approached him. He was tall, with kind eyes, and a British accent. "You speak quite well, young man," said the man. Rizal smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir, but I still have a long way to go," said Rizal. The man chuckled softly. "We all do. I'm Professor Bennett, by the way. I teach English at the university next door. You should join our open classes sometime." Rizal hesitated. "Do you think I can? My English is still not good enough." Professor Bennett shook his head. "You'll never feel ready if you wait for perfection. Come next Monday," said Bennett with a smile. That night, Rizal could hardly sleep. He was nervous, but also excited. On Monday morning, he arrived early at the classroom. The students greeted him warmly, and the professor introduced him as a hard-working learner who never gave up. Those words stayed with him. During the lesson, the professor asked the class to form small groups and discuss a topic. What does learning mean to you? Rizal's hands trembled as he tried to speak, but then he remembered the mirror, Laura's words, and the sound of his own voice saying, "I am not afraid anymore."
He took a deep breath and said slowly, "For me, learning means not giving up, even when you feel small. It means trying again, even when your voice shakes." The classroom fell silent for a moment. Then someone clapped, and others followed. Rizal smiled for the first time while speaking English in public. His fear was still there, but it no longer controlled him. After class, Professor Bennett patted him on the shoulder. "Well said, Rizal. That's the spirit every learner should have."
Later that week, Laura returned to the cafe. She had been away for a while, busy with her exams. When she saw Rizal, she smiled. "Hey, it's been a while. How's your English now?" Rizal laughed softly. "Better, I think," said Rizal. She tilted her head and said playfully, "Really? Let me hear you then." Rizal smiled and replied, "I've been practicing every day. I joined a conversation club, and now I even talk in class," said Rizal proudly. Laura's eyes widened. "That's amazing, Rizal. I told you, mistakes aren't bad. You just needed to believe in yourself." He nodded. "You were right, Laura. I was afraid for too long, but now I want to keep learning, maybe even teach others one day." She smiled warmly. "You will, I'm sure of it." That night, Rizal closed the cafe and walked home under the quiet Jakarta sky. The city lights shimmered on the wet streets after a light rain. He felt calm, proud, and strangely at peace. In his small room, he stood again before the old mirror, the same mirror that had once reflected his silence and fear. He looked at his reflection and said in English, "I'm not afraid to speak anymore," said Rizal. Then he smiled, this time with confidence, not doubt. Outside, the city continued to hum with life. Motorbikes rushing by, voices echoing through narrow streets. And somewhere in that endless noise, Rizal's voice joined in. Not perfect, not fluent, but real, alive, and brave. Learning a language, or anything new, is not about being perfect. It's about showing up, trying again, and speaking even when your voice shakes.